wanted to talk a little bit about some of the application modernization patterns we were seeing. Starting with one of the things that AWS came out with Refactor spaces this year, reInvent, and one of the things that that's designed to do is facilitate the strangler pattern, right? So you have a monolith and you want to take this thing apart, but you can't do it all at once. So you introduce a facade, maybe it's an application path-based routing that you can take off, say, the customer or the the orders feature, and start to carve that out. The idea being that once this clean facade is built around the old monolith functionality, you can now carve that out, and you might move that functionality into containers. You might move that into a serverless approach, but now it can be treated as a microservice, and it can be managed and it can be rapid in that way. So that's one approach to sort of application modernization. What else are you seeing in the field? I know you had a challenge recently with a container-based deployment.
Well, and it's interesting because even sometimes a customer will have what they think are microservices, or they'll have elevated beyond just a single monolith. Mm-hmm. But what we find is that once we dig a little deeper, it turns out they're just using what we refer to as a distributed monolith. So they have those separate endpoints for various services. Each one of those endpoints might have even graduated to the point where it's horizontally scalable and independent, so that no service is necessarily a single linchpin to the entire system. But they're inevitably talking to a single data source on the back end. So what ends up happening is they think that they're running microservices, but a true microservice has its own data source for each application, essentially. But with a single database at the back end, you now have infinitely horizontally scalable application layers, which then talk to a database and can inevitably end up DDoSing yourself. And so I'm curious, how does that kind of relate back to this idea of the strangler pattern, and how do you avoid that?
Yeah, and I think both of those are, so there's obviously a good pattern at the application layer there. That's a similar approach that the strangler pattern takes, is to worry about the application layer and the interface. You're still perfectly capable of shooting yourself in the foot by pointing back to one data store, right? So it really is about sort of due diligence and making sure that you're separating out not just the functionality as you decompose that monolith or you take the legacy application apart, but also, to your point, like, make sure all the dependencies are decoupled, right? And even going further, sometimes what we'll see, right, is you have synchronous calls. So I have a dozen services, but they're all synchronous calls. So effectively now I've got it, again, like you said, a distributed monolith. One of the better practices we see there is things like a bulkhead pattern where you're making sure that you're able to short circuit some of these calls, or queuing. Like, what other patterns are you seeing that's allowing for that sort of graceful degradation of services? Like, horizontal scaling is great, right? Like, you're able to handle that extra load, but then there are some failure modes as well.
Right, and it's really about sort of embracing the architecture of having everything be completely distributed. So queues are a major part of that, because you want messages or events to go somewhere and not necessarily be handled at the same exact time by everything. So queues, SQS and Amazon is sort of a backbone for a lot of these services. But there are also other message bus services in the background, like Kafka, or Amazon's managed Kafka service, that you can leverage, and it'll create streams of data so that other clients can basically pull that data out of the stream and then process it asynchronously. And those kinds of moves are really critical so that you don't end up shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, for sure. One of the challenges I'd imagine that the customer's seeing as well, as you sort of break these pieces apart, and now instead of one big service that maybe scales vertically, I've got a dozen services that scale horizontally or independently. They're completely decoupled. Let's imagine we didn't make the mistake that the client that you were working with was. What are people doing about monitoring? Like, is that the next challenge? That, like, now instead of monitoring one big thing, I've got to monitor 12 small things, or the components they're in?
The biggest challenge is trying to figure out where the monitoring and particularly logging are all going. So if there's already a centralized logging solution in place, what we like to do is leverage that already, because it's comfortable, it's familiar, everybody knows about it already. But the goal then shifts to not capturing that data from a central location, but capturing it from multiple endpoints. So things like if you can integrate your log shipping and metric collection at the application level so that it's actually ingrained in the container or the serverless function that you're deploying, and then it ships that data directly to your centralized logging and metric collector, then you can essentially bypass any middleman that you have to create. There are alternatives, particularly in AWS, where a lot of these services are naturally going to be shipping metrics and log data to things like CloudWatch, right? So there are solutions where you can deploy an extra service that will go and collect all of the information from CloudWatch metrics, CloudWatch logs, and then ship them to wherever you need the endpoint to go. But realistically, bypassing that and eliminating the need for additional infrastructure that you then have to manage and deploy is going to be a much cleaner approach to any of those situations.
That makes sense. And like you said, a lot of those services, especially Lambda, is going to expose some metrics to CloudWatch natively. So it's more of turning on a setting versus configuring a whole new program to incorporate with.
Assuming I'm a customer who has worked with Kalent and we've migrated workloads and they're modernized, what comes next and what did I gain from that?
So a number of things. The number one thing being velocity. So typically, right, when we're gonna migrate and modernize a workload, a lot of automation comes along with it. So rather than doing a one-time activity like a lift and shift approach might be, that automation that we've built into the migration is going to be the same automation that's used in day two operations, right? So now we don't have a different process that was used for this one-time migration event. We have a migration that's used as the first iteration of a number of successive events. The value that brings is that the product owners now, the sort of the business, if you will, are able to sort of make change faster. We've potentially decoupled the monolith and we decompose that so that microservices can evolve independently and as quickly or slowly as they need. We may have broken this up into a Kubernetes-based deployment, but it's automated. So now the code changes get through in a predictable fashion. Maybe they have test automation built in. Those kinds of things like speed up business objectives. The other piece of that is that day two, sometimes there's some sort of DevOps or some operations and monitoring that maybe that customer doesn't want to do. Maybe just like with AWS services, where AWS takes off the undifferentiated heavy lifting in a managed service, Kalent can also engage in what we call a pods model, that ongoing service delivery, working from a shared backlog with the customer. So it may be that's a DevOps approach, or our application development team is engaged on a long-term basis to continue to evolve what we've built with them. So there's a lot of ways that we can help with day two. There's a lot of ways that we also set up just for a successful day two if customers want to do that on their own.
So in pre-sales, you talk to a lot of customers. What are some of the patterns that you're picking up on?
Yeah, well, every customer is unique, right? They're going to have unique business objectives, but what we do see is there starts to become some commonality in the industry, right? So the first thing, that Kubernetes is a buzzword today. Amazon has a number of ways that you can host containers on AWS. I think that's a great pattern for customers that are coming from a VM-based workload. They may be coming from bare metal. They're more comfortable with the approach of they're thinking about little machines. So maybe it's essentially a smaller VM, and they're sort of thinking about it that way. For that, what we've done is we've built a Kubernetes catalyst that the idea there is to get people started on the right foot. So not to really worry about the small VMs, if you will, the containers themselves, rather than the infrastructure and the complexity that's needed to care and feed for it, the registry and the monitoring and the other services that accompany it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is sometimes we'll have customers come to us with what we might call a greenfield approach, right? They don't have something in place, they're building a new application. And for that, what we'd like to do is we like to steer towards our Cloud Native Application Foundation catalyst, because what that does is it sets them up to use AWS native services like Lambda, or managed services like RDS or DynamoDB, so that they're using modern managed services that now they're not going to have to worry about the infrastructure that's running it, they're just worrying about the code, and we're helping them develop pipelines that deploy that code. So there's a lot of acceleration, not having to worry about that legacy technical debt.
So these catalysts basically help them get on the right path, but there's enough of them that they can kind of choose, or we can help them choose which is the best path for them to follow.
Yeah, actually, so that path choice kind of comes before the catalyst, right? That's a conversation that my team and I are having, understanding the customer's specific needs, and the catalyst may or may not apply. Obviously, Kalent has we have custom professional services that we can bring exact needs to the customers, but these were designed to take that early switch. We talked about whether it's a sort of an existing legacy workload or a more modern sort of greenfield approach. That's an immediate sort of indicator as to which direction we might go, what catalyst might apply. But ultimately, those are starting points, and they may or may not be the right starting point for every customer, but it's a starting point for a lot of customers, and they may pick that up and run on their own, or they may continue with Kalent and build out something that's even beyond the sort of starting point.
Sounds like a great partnership.
And we try to make it that way, yes.